Welcome to What is Problem Structuring? I'm Luke Horton. Unstructured problems. So far in the course, we've discussed the nature of problems to be somewhat structured and have multiple possible options. For the rest of the course, we're going to deal with unstructured problems. Unstructured problems are really a collection of symptoms that make some kind of output that you notice in the daily flow of life. So you see the symptoms, say poverty, for example, or other areas like that. You see the symptoms, but you don't quite know what the cause is. You don't know what the root cause is. You know what the pain is, but you don't know how to name it. How can a problem not have a structure? Well, it is yet to be interpreted. And this is really what problem structuring is. Interpreting the problem, putting it within a frame, and helping it to have some kind of shape so we can do something about it. Something like poverty, for example, we see that we've labeled it, we see it, but we don't quite understand the nature of it yet. If a problem is unstructured, it doesn't actually have a clear definition. Different stakeholders might hold different opinions on what the problem actually is, and we are not able to understand with any degree of clarity how it might work or what might be the best way to tackle it. The most important part of that is we can only ever conceptualize what the problem is, and we can only ever have a working definition of how it might work. But those concepts end up being the solutions that we use to solve the problem issue. In this model here, you see the basic concept of problem structuring. We all work and live in a complex social and natural environment. The natural environment might be giving us signs, like the climate change, for example. But we work in a social world where there are complex, unstructured problems on a daily basis. So where the arrow is, going into the participatory process, we see complex, unstructured issues. We see things like disagreements, mediations, ambiguity, uncertainty, problems with a variety of different things. What we do is we put the problem in a frame by mapping stakeholder perceptions and using the knowledge base we have. We interpret the problem and we put it into some kind of negotiated or agreed upon term. They call this problem structuring because it's not problem solving because you can't solve it. What you're doing is you are structuring an interpretation of the problem that can be turned into a sequences of actions. So if you imagine we look at disagreement, we have a disagreement. What's the problem? We don't know, but there are different perceptions on what the problem might be. Remember back to session 1, we talked about the gap between what is expected and what is real. That gap between expectation and reality is the cognitive dissonance that becomes the frame that the problem lives in. Another way of saying that would be, if we have different stakeholder perceptions, we have different perceptions of what the problem is. But what we have to do is work out how to build traction. And later on in the course, we'll talk about the two big methods that you need to learn to be successful in this area. The issue is, how do I do that? How do I structure a problem? How do I put it into a context that it makes sense? And how do I get to that stage where we can negotiate knowledge and agree upon a valid solution? How do I do that? Here's an example of what we call the Australian housing crisis. This comes from a paper that I wrote some years ago about irrational enthusiasm in the market and the people that create the problem. If you look at the bold text, in the bold text, we see the economy, developers, homeowners, and greed being 4 different ways of conceptualizing the housing crisis. So in other words, it's the economy. Everybody wants a house. The government feeds into that, and developers feed into investors, and that feeds into greed and into homeowners, the Australian dream, and the housing crisis. So that's just one way of looking at the 4 different ways that you can carve up this problem. In reality, nobody really knows what causes the housing crisis or why the market keeps increasing in some areas and decreasing in others. Nobody really understands or fully comes to grips with what that issue is. And in the meantime, what we have to do is make sure we understand how we can solve this issue. The point being that if we continue along the same path, the problem will continue. We have to structure it and we have to pick a part of the problem that we can try and solve. Otherwise, we have to synthesize and try and come up with a new concept, as I'll discuss in the next couple of sessions. Scholar Peter Cheklin says it this way. Peter Cheklin says it this way: we don't solve unstructured problems, we structure them. In other words, we finish them, we give them a shape and a form, and we say, that's it, this is as far as we want to go with this problem. So what the big difference is between problem structuring and problem solving is, in problem structuring, you're just trying to put a shape around the problem, put a harness on it so something can be done. Some people have different opinions, and other people have different ways of understanding it. We engage problems and we finish with it. So we might get to a certain stage where we've got a shape and we're happy with the structure that the problem currently has, and we don't want to shape it or structure it any further. Some problems also get down into deep issues, and it means that you can't actually solve that effectively. Consider breathing, for example. You don't have to think about breathing. You just breathe, and it's, unless you have some kind of respiratory problem, you don't have to think about breathing whatsoever. However, there are times when learning how to breathe and knowing how to breathe are extremely helpful. And I can tell you from personal experience, being an asthmatic, it's not fun when it's difficult to breathe. So what are we really saying here? Well, what Cheklin's saying is that you don't notice the structure problems have, and you take for granted the shape that they come in, and you don't actually understand or fully realize the issues that come to bear when you're dealing with problem structuring. In other words, you just see it, it's there, and you have to structure it. There's no way around it. And human beings do this like breathing. When we're thrown into a situation, we immediately try and make sense of it. And that's how we cope. So what we do then is we build concepts to better understand a problem. We build concepts and we structure them. So have a look at this example case from my own research. This is a case study I did several years ago on nurses and doctors not sharing information in a small part of a hospital here in Brisbane. The issue became very rapidly that nurses wouldn't do certain things and doctors wouldn't do certain things. So if here's the nurse in the middle of that diagram, the nurse had to deal with management thinking in the hospital, the way it was done, the assumptions about medical authority, medical laws, and patient privilege, and all of those things were built into the nurse's head. So as the nurse is doing his or her daily job, they are thinking about all of these patterns that they go through on a daily basis. They're thinking about how to interact, how to understand it, how to cope with it, and how to deal with it. On the other hand, this was some of the things that we noticed from the action. There were different interactions with the data. The judgments were being made on patient well-being. Understanding the doctor's handwriting was a problem. Certain nurses would not talk to doctors and so forth, and different people were using forms to store information. The reality of the situation was, how do we solve it? So we're faced with this problem, how do we solve it? Well, the thing was, we had to work with nurses and doctors to bring them together onto the same page. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, so nothing actually changed. But when in talking to nurses and talking to doctors, you could see the different perceptions of the problem. You could see how the doctors were there to solve medical issues and deal with life or death matters, but so were nurses, but they were dealing with different ends of the same problem. Even though we never saw change in this problem, one of the recommendations was, how do we get nurses and doctors to think about the same problem in the same way? That is, how do we get them to understand that you both need this information, you both are on the same page? How do we do that? And how do we get around the ideas or the risk aversity that's in hospitals to get information sharing taking place? Because the reality is, there's a patient there who needs care. If they're getting multiple nurses a day and they've all got different information, why is that happening? We couldn't solve it, but the concept needed to be changed. The underlying concept of what they were doing needed to be changed, so that the action that was built on top of that needed to be changed. So think about anything, and let's go back to that first session. Work backwards from what's observable to a series of possible answers, and you begin to understand things differently. You can reorganize things in a different way. So in class this week, what we'll be doing is looking at a couple of exercises where we will be dealing directly with it. And let me just show you briefly another video for those of you that are engaged in the course. I put up another video here for you called What's the Problem? In the Rosenhead reading, which I'll quickly click on for you. Oh, don't look at that. This is an introduction to problem structuring. I would recommend that you all read it, not because the street is named after me or anything like that, but have a look at what he's trying to say here. This has been my experience in dealing with complex problems and different issues. So please check out this reading and have a look. The best part about this reading is towards the end, where he talks about the characteristics of problem structuring methods. And that is outside the scope of this course, but there is a book called Problem Structuring Methods in Action, which I'd recommend you would all read. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you online or in class.